They refused him water in town that morning, but by sunrise the next day, 50 Apache riders stood outside his farm carrying gifts no man in that valley had ever seen. Ethan Carter had lived beside the Redstone River for nearly 12 years, and in all that time nothing much had changed except the weather and the slow fading paint on his little wooden house. His farm stretched barely 20 acres across the dusty edge of the valley, where the soil turned thin and stubborn and the wind carried the dry smell of sagebrush across the fields. Most men in town said that land wasn't worth the effort of breaking a sweat over. But Ethan worked it anyway. Sunrise to sundown, season after season, the quiet farmer with the worn hat and steady hands plowed the same ground with the same tired mule, hoping one good harvest might finally turn his luck. Folks in the nearby town of Dry Creek didn't think much about Ethan Carter. Some barely noticed him at all. A poor farmer living alone on the edge of Apache territory didn't make for good company or useful conversation. When he rode into town for supplies once every couple weeks, people nodded politely enough, but their eyes always drifted away like they were already thinking about something else. That morning had been no different. Ethan had walked into the small general store with dust still clinging to his boots and asked the shopkeeper for a sack of cornmeal and a jug of fresh water. The shopkeeper handed him the cornmeal without a word, but pulled the water jug back just before Ethan's fingers touched it. "Water's for paying customers today," the man muttered, glancing at Ethan's worn coat like it explained everything. Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded, placed the cornmeal back on the counter, and stepped outside into the sunlit street without another word. Pride weighed more than thirst out here. So he climbed back onto his mule and started the slow 4-mile ride home. The afternoon sun hung low over the valley by the time Ethan reached the bend where the Redstone River cut through the canyon walls. The river wasn't wide, maybe 30 feet across in most places, but the current moved fast over the jagged stones beneath the surface, and every rancher in the valley knew to respect that water. Ethan had crossed that river hundreds of times over the years, usually at the same shallow stretch where the rocks formed a narrow path through the rushing water. But that evening something felt different the moment he heard it. A voice, faint at first, then clearer, someone calling for help somewhere upstream. Ethan pulled the mule to a stop and listened again. The wind carried the sound across the water, urgent, breathless, and unmistakably human. He slid down from the saddle and walked toward the edge of the riverbank, squinting into the late afternoon light. That's when he saw her, a young girl caught between two slick boulders in the middle of the river, her hands gripping the stone while the current pulled at her legs like the river itself wanted to carry her away. Her dark hair clung to her face, and even from 30 yards away Ethan could see the exhaustion in her movements. She was trying to climb out of the water, but every step slipped against the smooth rock beneath her feet. Ethan took one step closer to the river and then stopped, because the moment the girl lifted her head, the sunlight revealed the beaded necklace around her neck and the pattern stitched into the fabric of her soaked dress. Apache. Out here, that single word could change a man's fate faster than a desert storm. And for a long moment Ethan Carter stood there in the dust, staring at the rushing water and the stranger struggling against it, knowing that whatever choice he made next would follow him long after the river carried the sound away. The river water was cold enough to bite through leather boots, and Ethan Carter knew it before his first step touched the current. The Redstone River ran fast this time of year, fed by snow melting high in the mountains nearly 50 miles north. The water churned around his legs the moment he stepped in, pushing against him with a quiet strength that reminded him just how small one man could feel out here. The girl looked up again when she heard the splash of his boots entering the river, and for a brief moment something crossed her face that was difficult to read. It was not fear exactly, but it was not relief either. Perhaps it was the look of someone who understood the weight of strangers meeting where two worlds rarely touched. Ethan moved slowly, planting each step carefully between the smooth stones beneath the surface. One wrong step in that river could send a man flat into the current, and the water would not care whether he was farmer, trader, or chief. By the time he reached the middle of the crossing, the water had climbed nearly to his waist. The cold seeped through his clothes, but he kept moving until he was close enough to see the trembling in the girl's hands as she clung to the rock. Up close, she looked younger than he first thought, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, her face pale from the long struggle against the water. The beaded necklace around her neck glimmered faintly in the fading light, turquoise stones woven carefully into leather cord. Ethan had seen enough Apache traders pass through the valley to recognize the craftsmanship immediately. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The river filled the silence with its endless rushing sound, water sliding across stone and foam spinning in slow circles downstream. Finally, Ethan held out his hand, steady and open. "You are going to slip if you stay there," he said quietly. His voice carried the calm tone of someone used to speaking more to animals and wind than to people. The girl hesitated only a second before releasing one hand from the rock. Her fingers were cold when they touched his, lighter than he expected, but gripping with surprising strength. Ethan shifted his footing and guided her carefully off the stone. The current tugged at them both immediately, but Ethan leaned his weight into the river the way he had learned during years of crossing these waters with heavy loads. Step by step they moved together toward the shallow side of the bank. Twice her footing slipped, and twice Ethan steadied her before the river could pull her away again. When they finally reached the muddy shore, the girl collapsed to her knees, breathing hard but safe from the pull of the current. Ethan stepped back and let the river drain from his coat. The late afternoon sun painted the canyon walls in warm copper light, and for a few seconds the valley felt strangely quiet again. The girl pushed damp hair away from her face and looked up at him. Her dark eyes studied him carefully, as though she was trying to memorize every detail about the stranger standing before her. "Thank you," she said at last, her English careful but clear. Ethan nodded once. He removed the small canvas sack from his saddle and pulled out a piece of bread he had saved for the ride home. He offered it to her without speaking. She accepted it slowly, still watching him with that same thoughtful expression. After a moment she spoke again, this time softer. "You should not have come into the water." Ethan glanced toward the flowing river behind them. "Maybe," he replied. The girl finished the bread and rose to her feet, steadier now but still tired. She looked once toward the distant hills where the forest thickened beyond the canyon. Then she turned back to Ethan Carter. Something about her expression had changed. It carried a quiet urgency now, like the moment just before a storm rolls across the prairie. "If my father finds you first," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind moving through the sagebrush, "you should run." And before Ethan could ask what she meant, the girl stepped away from the riverbank and disappeared into the trees that lined the edge of the valley, leaving the quiet farmer standing alone beside the rushing water, wondering why a simple act of help suddenly felt like the beginning of something far larger than either of them. The wind moved slowly across the valley as Ethan Carter rode the last mile back toward his small farm, the sound of the Redstone River fading behind him while the evening light stretched long shadows across the dry grass. The mule walked at its usual patient pace, hooves tapping softly against the dusty trail that wound through the low hills toward the little cabin that had been Ethan's home for more than a decade. Normally that ride felt quiet and predictable, the kind of peaceful routine a man came to trust after years of living alone on the edge of the frontier. But that evening the girl's final words would not leave his mind. "If my father finds you first, you should run." Ethan had lived near Apache territory long enough to understand what those words might mean. The tribes that traveled through these lands protected their own with a seriousness that settlers in town often misunderstood. A stranger helping an Apache girl might be seen as kindness, or it might be seen as interference. Out here the difference between those two things was sometimes no wider than the river he had just crossed. The sun dropped lower behind the canyon walls as Ethan reached the wooden gate that marked the edge of his property. The hinges creaked the same way they always had when he pushed the gate open, and the familiar sight of his farm spread out before him beneath the fading sky. A narrow field of dry corn stretched across the southern side of the land, its pale leaves rustling in the evening breeze. The small barn leaned slightly to the left where the foundation had shifted years earlier, and the old water trough beside the fence held barely enough water for the mule and the single aging horse that remained from better seasons long past. Ethan guided the mule toward the barn and tied the reins to the weathered post. He moved through the motions of evening chores the same way he had done hundreds of times before, brushing the mule down, filling the trough, and stacking the small bundle of firewood beside the cabin door. Yet every few minutes he caught himself glancing toward the distant tree line beyond the fields where the girl had disappeared into the forest. The valley remained still. No riders appeared. No distant voices carried through the wind. Only the soft hum of insects and the whisper of grass moving beneath the cooling air of dusk. When the chores were finished, Ethan stepped inside the cabin and lit the small oil lamp that hung from a nail near the wooden table. The warm light pushed back the gathering darkness just enough to reveal the simple room that held everything he owned. A narrow bed stood against the far wall beneath a window that looked out toward the river valley. A cast iron stove rested in the corner beside a stack of split logs, and the table itself held little more than a tin plate, a worn Bible, and the small leather pouch where Ethan kept the few coins he earned from selling corn in Dry Creek when the harvest allowed it. He poured a cup of water from the clay jug near the sink and sat down at the table, listening to the quiet creak of the cabin as the night settled over the valley. For a long time he said nothing, and did nothing, simply staring into the lamp flame while the girl's warning repeated itself in his thoughts. If my father finds you first, you should run. Ethan Carter had never been a man who ran from much. The land had taught him patience, and the years had taught him that most trouble passed like summer storms if a man kept his head and waited. Still, something about the way the girl had spoken stayed with him. There had been urgency in her voice, but also something else. Not anger, not fear, something closer to concern. As though the warning had not been meant as a threat, but as protection. The lamp flame flickered softly while the night deepened outside the cabin walls. Eventually Ethan rose from the chair and stepped onto the small porch. The sky above the valley had turned deep blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the dark ridge lines beyond the river. The air carried the cool scent of sagebrush and distant water, and the land stretched silent and empty beneath the moonless sky. Ethan leaned against the porch railing and looked toward the horizon where the road from Dry Creek wound across the hills. For a long moment there was nothing there. Then far in the distance something faint stirred along the trail. A thin cloud of dust lifted slowly above the ridge, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable to a man who had spent years reading the land. Riders. More than one. And they were heading straight toward Ethan Carter's farm. The dust cloud on the horizon grew slowly but steadily as the minutes passed, drifting higher above the dark ridge like a signal the valley itself was sending toward Ethan Carter's lonely porch. Out here a man learned to read the land the same way other men read newspapers, and that rising trail of dust told him one simple truth. More than one horse was riding the road tonight. Ethan stood still beside the porch railing, the cool night air brushing against his coat, while the first stars brightened above the canyon. The valley remained quiet except for the distant sound of the Redstone River and the slow creak of the barn door shifting in the wind. Yet the land felt different now, as if the stillness was holding its breath. He stepped down from the porch and walked a few yards into the open field, squinting toward the road that curved down from the hills nearly half a mile away. The riders were still too far to see clearly, but their presence was unmistakable. The dust moved in several separate streams, rising and falling with the rhythm of hooves striking the hard earth. Ethan counted the shapes carefully as they began to form against the dim horizon. One rider would have made a narrow line of dust. Two riders might have spread the trail slightly wider. But this cloud stretched across the road like a moving wall of pale smoke. There were many of them. Ethan rested one hand on the wooden fence post beside the field and continued watching. Years of quiet farm life had taught him patience, and patience had often saved him more trouble than any rifle ever could. Still, the girl's warning echoed again inside his thoughts. If my father finds you first, you should run. The memory returned as clearly as if she had spoken it beside him only seconds earlier. Her voice had carried urgency, but it had also carried something else. Respect. As if she understood that Ethan Carter had stepped into something far larger than the moment beside the river. The dust cloud continued moving down the road, and soon the shapes of the riders themselves began to emerge beneath the starlight. Dark silhouettes on horseback, riding in a loose formation that stretched across the width of the trail. Their horses moved with steady confidence, neither rushing nor slowing, simply covering the distance between the hills and the quiet farm that waited below. Ethan did not move. The mule shifted softly in the barn behind him, sensing the change in the night air, but the farmer remained where he stood with both hands resting lightly on the fence. By the time the riders reached the lower slope of the valley, the moon had climbed high enough to cast a pale silver light across the fields. That was when Ethan saw the details that removed all doubt about who they were. Feathers moved gently above several of the riders' shoulders. The horses wore decorated reins that caught the moonlight with flashes of beadwork and metal. And at the front of the group rode a tall figure whose posture carried the quiet authority of someone long accustomed to being followed. Ethan Carter had lived near Apache territory long enough to recognize the signs. A tribal riding party had arrived in the valley. The riders slowed as they approached the edge of Ethan's property, their horses spreading out across the open ground in a wide arc that surrounded the small farm without ever crossing the fence line. There was no shouting, no sudden movement, only the soft breathing of horses and the quiet sound of leather shifting as the riders settled into place beneath the moon. Ethan counted again, 20 riders at least, perhaps more waiting behind the rise where the road curved out of sight. The tall rider at the front raised one hand slightly, and the entire group came to a halt as smoothly as if the valley itself had spoken the command. For several seconds nothing happened. The riders remained still in their saddles, watching the lone farmer standing beside his fence under the pale light of the rising moon. Then from somewhere behind the front line of horses a familiar figure stepped forward into the open space between them. The same turquoise necklace caught the moonlight as she moved. The same dark hair fell across her shoulders as she approached the fence. The girl from the river had returned. She stopped a few yards away from Ethan Carter and looked at him with the same calm eyes that had studied him beside the rushing water earlier that evening. Then she turned slightly toward the tall rider behind her and spoke a few quiet words in her native language. The tall rider listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he guided his horse forward slowly until he stood directly opposite Ethan on the other side of the wooden fence. The man's face carried the calm strength of someone who had spent a lifetime leading others across difficult lands. His long gray braid rested against a coat decorated with careful beadwork, and his eyes studied Ethan Carter the way a wise man studies the horizon before deciding which path to take. Finally, he spoke in clear, measured English that carried easily through the quiet night air. "You are the farmer who helped my daughter cross the river." The man's words settled into the quiet night air like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan Carter did not answer immediately. He simply looked across the fence at the tall rider, whose calm presence seemed to hold the entire valley in place. The moonlight revealed more of the man's face now, deep lines carved by years of sun, wind, and responsibility. This was not just a rider leading a group through the hills. This was someone the others trusted with their lives. The girl stepped slightly closer to the fence, her turquoise necklace catching the pale silver light. "My father is Chief Dakota," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same careful tone Ethan remembered from the riverbank. "And I am Iona." Ethan nodded once, slow and respectful. Out here names carried weight, and the name of a tribal chief carried more weight than most men in Dry Creek would ever understand. Chief Dakota studied Ethan for a long moment before speaking again. His eyes moved across the farm behind the farmer, taking in every detail without hurry. The leaning barn, the narrow field of struggling corn, the single horse standing quietly beside the trough. It was the look of a man measuring not wealth or power but character. Finally, the chief rested one hand gently on the saddle horn and spoke again. "My daughter told me what happened at the river." Ethan shifted his weight slightly against the fence. "She was having trouble with the current," he replied simply. "Anyone would have helped." The girl glanced at him, and for a brief moment a small smile touched the corner of her mouth, as though she knew the truth was not quite that simple. Chief Dakota nodded slowly. "Not everyone would have stepped into that water," he said. "Many people in this valley would have walked away." The night wind moved softly through the grass as the riders waited behind their leader. Their horses stood calm and patient, trained for long journeys and quiet discipline. None of the riders spoke. None of them moved closer. They simply watched the exchange between their chief and the farmer beside the fence. Ethan felt the weight of those quiet eyes, but did not look away. Years of living alone had taught him that honesty traveled farther than fear ever could. Chief Dakota guided his horse a step closer to the fence and reached down to pick up a small leather bundle tied carefully to the saddle. The leather was dark and smooth, decorated with fine beadwork that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Without a Word he extended the bundle across the fence toward Ethan Carter. Ethan hesitated only a second before taking it. The leather felt heavy in his hands, far heavier than its size suggested. He untied the cord slowly and opened the bundle just enough to see what rested inside. The moonlight caught the edges of polished silver bracelets, several small turquoise stones, and a neatly folded cloth embroidered with careful patterns that spoke of long hours of patient craftsmanship. Ethan closed the bundle again almost immediately and looked back up at the chief. "I cannot take this," he said quietly. Chief Takoda's expression remained calm. "It is a gift from my people," he replied. "A man who helps my daughter has shown respect to our family." Ethan shook his head gently. "I did not help her for payment." The chief watched him for a moment longer, then slowly nodded again, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "That is exactly why you deserve it," he said. The girl stepped forward beside her father's horse and looked directly at Ethan Carter. "You gave me food when you did not know who I was," she said. "You stepped into the river even after you saw my necklace." The wind brushed through the field again, carrying the quiet scent of sage and cool water across the land. Ethan Carter stood there holding the small leather bundle while the riders watched beneath the moon. For a moment, the valley felt balanced between two worlds that rarely understood each other. Finally, Chief Takoda spoke again, his voice steady and certain. "Kindness travels farther than any horse," he said. "And tonight it brought us here." Behind him, the riders shifted slightly in their saddles, and one by one several of them began guiding their horses forward toward the fence, each carrying something tied behind their saddles. Ethan Carter suddenly realized that the small bundle in his hands was only the beginning. For a moment, Ethan Carter thought the chief had finished speaking, but then the quiet line of riders behind him began to move. One horse stepped forward, then another, their hooves pressing softly into the dry earth of the valley floor. The riders approached slowly, each guiding their horse with calm patience until they stopped a few feet from the wooden fence that marked the edge of Ethan's small property. The moonlight revealed the bundles. Tied behind their saddles, leather packs and cloth wrappings secured carefully with braided cord. None of the riders spoke. They simply dismounted one by one and carried the items forward. The first man placed a large sack beside the fence and stepped back. Ethan glanced down and saw the faint outline of dried corn and grain through the woven cloth. More food than his farm had produced during the last difficult harvest. The second rider stepped forward and laid down a folded blanket made of thick wool dyed in deep red and brown patterns that reflected the traditional designs of the Apache people. The material looked warm enough to hold back the cold winds that swept through the valley every winter. A third rider approached carrying a bundle of cured leather tools and simple hand-carved farming implements, tools that looked sturdier than many of the worn pieces hanging inside Ethan's barn. Each rider placed their gift quietly beside the fence and returned to their horse without waiting for thanks or recognition. Ethan stood there holding the small leather pouch while the collection beside the fence slowly grew larger. Corn, blankets, tools, dried meat wrapped in cloth, even a small saddle crafted with careful detail that suggested many hours of patient work. None of it felt like payment. It felt like respect. The night air carried the smell of horses, leather, and sagebrush while the quiet ceremony continued beneath the moon. Ethan Carter had never owned much in his life. The small farm behind him represented years of hard work and stubborn determination against land that did not easily reward a farmer's effort. Most seasons he barely grew enough corn to trade for flour and salt in Dry Creek. Yet here before him stood gifts that could change the coming winter entirely. Enough grain to feed both himself and his animals. Enough tools to repair the old plow that had nearly broken last spring. Enough blankets to keep the cabin warm even when snow covered the valley floor. When the final rider placed his bundle beside the fence, the group stepped back once more, returning to their horses with the same quiet discipline they had shown since arriving. Chief Takoda watched the scene with calm approval, his steady eyes resting on Ethan Carter as the farmer tried to gather his thoughts. Ethan finally lifted his head and looked at the chief again. "This is far more than I deserve," he said quietly. The chief shook his head once, slowly. "A man does not measure kindness by its size," he replied. "A small act can carry great meaning." Ayana stepped forward again beside the fence, her expression softer now than when she first appeared beneath the moonlight. You helped a stranger when you had no reason to trust her, she said. My people remember such things. Ethan glanced down at the growing pile beside the fence, and then back toward the riders standing patiently behind their leader. Most folks in Dry Creek would not see it the same way, he admitted. Chief Tuckoda followed Ethan's gaze toward the distant road that led back to the town beyond the hills. For a moment the chief said nothing, and the silence between them stretched across the field like a quiet understanding. Finally he spoke again. Many people see only the difference between us, he said. But tonight my people saw the character of one man. The chief straightened slightly in his saddle and raised one hand toward the riders. Instantly the group mounted their horses again, their movements calm and practiced beneath the pale moonlight. Ethan realized then that the tribe had not come to stay. They had come to honor something. And now they were preparing to leave just as quietly as they had arrived. Before turning his horse, Chief Tuckoda looked once more at the farmers standing beside the fence. Take these gifts, he said. Use them well. Then he paused for a brief moment and added one final sentence that carried the quiet weight of truth across the valley. The land remembers the hearts of the people who walk upon it. The riders did not leave immediately. For a moment they remained gathered beneath the moonlight, their horses shifting quietly as the wind carried the soft scent of sage across the valley. Ethan Carter stood beside the wooden fence with the leather bundle still in his hands, looking at the growing collection of gifts that now rested along the edge of his field. Grain sacks, blankets, tools, and supplies that would have taken him years to gather on his own. The quiet farmer felt a strange weight settle in his chest, not the heavy burden of debt, but the humbling realization that a simple moment beside a river had somehow crossed the invisible line that separated two worlds. Chief Tuckoda studied Ethan for another long moment, as though measuring the farmer's thoughts even before they were spoken. Then the chief gently turned his horse slightly toward the valley road, signaling the riders behind him that their visit was nearing its end. One by one the Apache riders adjusted their reins and guided their horses into position, ready to follow their leader back toward the dark hills beyond the Redstone River. Yet before they could move, Ethan cleared his throat softly and spoke again. Chief Tuckoda. The tall man paused and looked back at him. Ethan glanced toward the fence where the supplies now formed a small line beneath the moonlight. If I keep all of this, people in Dry Creek will start asking questions. The chief's expression did not change, but a faint trace of understanding appeared in his eyes. And what would you tell them? Ethan looked toward the distant road leading to the town nearly 6 miles away. He could already imagine the whispers in the general store, the curious glances from ranchers leaning against hitching posts. A poor farmer did not suddenly gain new tools and grain without someone noticing. I would tell them the truth, Ethan said slowly, that your daughter needed help at the river. Ayanna smiled faintly again, though her father remained thoughtful. The truth is a strong path, the chief replied. But not everyone is ready to walk it. Ethan nodded slightly. He had lived long enough near Dry Creek to know exactly what the chief meant. The town carried its own ideas about the people who rode the plains beyond the valley. Some of those ideas had been passed down for years without anyone ever questioning where they began. The wind stirred the tall grass again, while the moon climbed higher above the canyon ridge. Finally Chief Tuckoda spoke once more. These gifts are not meant to create trouble for you, he said. They are meant to honor a moment of respect. Ethan looked down at the blankets and grain sacks beside the fence, and then back at the riders waiting patiently behind their leader. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he lifted the leather bundle slightly in his hands. Then perhaps there is a better way, he said quietly. Chief Tuckoda tilted his head slightly, inviting him to continue. Ethan gestured toward the sacks of grain. I will keep enough to get through the winter, he explained. But the rest should go to families in Dry Creek who need it more than I do. The riders behind the chief shifted slightly in their saddles, surprised by the farmer's words. Ayanna's eyes brightened with interest as she watched Ethan speak. Chief Tuckoda considered the idea carefully before answering. You would share gifts given to you? He asked. Ethan nodded once. Kindness should not stop at my fence. The valley fell quiet again after those words. The chief looked toward the distant lights of Dry Creek barely visible over the ridge, and then back at the farmer standing before him. Slowly, a small smile formed beneath his gray mustache. Then perhaps the valley will learn something tonight, he said. Behind him several riders nodded in quiet approval. The chief raised his hand once more, and this time the group began to move with gentle purpose. But instead of riding straight toward the hills, several riders guided their horses along the fence line and began tying the extra grain sacks across their saddles once again. They would carry the farmer's decision with them into the valley before dawn. As the riders prepared to leave, Ayanna stepped forward beside her father's horse one last time and looked at Ethan Carter with clear respect in her eyes. "My father says the land remembers the hearts of those who walk upon it," she said softly. "Tonight it will remember yours." The riders began moving with quiet purpose beneath the pale glow of the moon, their horses stepping slowly along the fence line as several of them carefully lifted the extra grain sacks and bundles back onto their saddles. Leather straps tightened, knots pulled firm, and within a few minutes the supplies Ethan had offered to share were secured once again for the journey toward Dry Creek. The valley remained calm, but the meaning of the moment hung in the air like the steady sound of the Redstone River flowing somewhere beyond the dark hills. Ethan Carter stood beside the fence watching it all unfold, the small leather pouch still resting in his hands while the Apache riders prepared for a different kind of ride than the one they had first planned. Instead of returning straight to the distant tribal lands, part of their path would now pass through the farming valley that surrounded the quiet town. Chief Takeda guided his horse forward once more until he stood directly across from Ethan beneath the silver moonlight. For a moment neither man spoke. The chief simply observed the farmer again, studying the calm expression of someone who had spent years working the land without expecting much in return. Finally the chief gave a slow nod. "A generous path often travels farther than the one a man first sees," he said quietly. Ethan glanced toward the distant ridge where the faint glow of lanterns in Dry Creek flickered against the darkness nearly 6 miles away. "Most people there have had a hard season," he replied. "The rain came late this year. Some farms barely produced enough to last the winter." Chief Takeda followed his gaze toward the small town lights and understood. The Apache riders had crossed many valleys during their lives. They knew the signs of difficult harvests, dry fields, and struggling families. Ayanna stepped forward beside the fence again, her eyes moving between the gifts and the quiet farm that surrounded them. "Then tonight your kindness will travel even farther," she said softly. The riders behind her finished securing the bundles, and one by one they turned their horses toward the valley road that wound through the low hills toward Dry Creek. The moon had climbed higher now, lighting the narrow trail like a pale ribbon stretching across the land. Chief Takeda raised his hand slightly, and the group began moving at a steady walking pace, guiding their horses along the fence line before turning toward the road. Yet before they reached the edge of the field, the chief paused once more and looked back at Ethan Carter standing alone beside his small farm. "Tomorrow morning," the chief said, "the people of Dry Creek will wake to a story they do not yet understand." Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. "Perhaps they will understand it someday." The chief considered that answer carefully, then nodded again with quiet approval. Ayanna gave Ethan one final look of gratitude before guiding her horse beside her father's. Then the riders continued down the valley road, their horses moving smoothly through the moonlit grass while the sound of hooves slowly faded into the distance. Ethan remained beside the fence long after the last rider disappeared beyond the hill. The wind moved softly through the cornfield behind him, and the quiet farm once again returned to its familiar stillness. Yet the night felt different now. Something had changed in the valley that could not be seen as easily as a rising dust cloud or a line of riders beneath the moon. Ethan finally turned and carried the remaining gifts toward the barn, setting them carefully beside the door where the tools and grain would be safe until morning. Then he stepped back outside and looked once more toward the distant lights of Dry Creek. Somewhere along that dark road the Apache riders were traveling toward the town with supplies that would soon appear in places where struggling families might never know exactly how they arrived. Ethan Carter rested his hands on the fence and listened to the quiet valley, realizing that sometimes the smallest moment beside a river could travel farther than any man expected. Morning arrived quietly over the Redstone Valley, the pale gold light of sunrise spreading across the dry fields as if the land itself had taken a slow breath after the long night. Ethan Carter stepped out onto his porch just as the first rays of sunlight touched the roof of his barn and the tops of the distant canyon walls. The air carried the cool scent of river water and sagebrush, and for a moment the valley looked exactly the way it always had. A narrow farm surrounded by tired corn rows. A leaning barn that had weathered more winters than Ethan could count. A single mule standing beside the trough, patiently waiting for the day to begin. Yet the quiet farmer knew the valley was not the same place it had been yesterday. He walked slowly across the yard and checked the tools that had been left beside the barn door during the night. The leather bundle still rested safely on the wooden crate where he had placed it. Inside were the silver bracelets, the turquoise stones, and the embroidered cloth that Chief Takota had offered with calm dignity. Ethan closed the pouch again and set it carefully back on the crate. Those items would remain with him, not as payment, but as a reminder of the moment beside the river when two strangers had trusted one another. The rest of the supplies were already gone. Before the sun had risen, the Apache riders had carried the extra grain and blankets down the valley road toward Dry Creek. Ethan had watched their fading silhouettes long after the moon disappeared behind the hills. Now the road lay empty again, winding quietly through the golden grass toward the town nearly 6 miles away. Ethan leaned against the fence and looked across the valley while the morning light grew stronger. He imagined the scene that might be unfolding in Dry Creek at that very moment. Farmers stepping outside their homes to begin their chores. Shopkeepers unlocking the doors of the general store. Children carrying buckets toward the well near the center of town. And somewhere among those familiar routines, sacks of grain and folded blankets appearing where none had been the night before. Perhaps someone would find a bundle near their barn door. Perhaps another family would discover tools resting beside their fence. No rider would remain to explain where the gifts had come from. The valley would simply wake to quiet evidence that kindness sometimes travels farther than expected. Ethan Carter smiled faintly at the thought. He had spent most of his life believing the world moved slowly, shaped by seasons, rain, and the patience of the land itself. Yet the events of the previous evening had shown him something different. Sometimes a single decision could cross boundaries that years of silence never could. Sometimes stepping into a river to help a stranger could ripple outward in ways a man might never fully see. The sun climbed higher above the canyon ridge, warming the valley floor and lighting the distant road with a soft golden glow. Ethan picked up his hat from the porch rail and settled it comfortably on his head. The fields still needed tending. The mules still needed harnessing. Life on the farm would continue the way it always had, measured in long days and quiet evenings beneath the open sky. But somewhere beyond the hills, families in Dry Creek would begin their morning with unexpected hope, and riders from the Apache tribe would return to their lands carrying the story of a quiet farmer who had stepped into cold water without asking who needed help. Ethan Carter rested his hands on the fence one last time and looked across the Redstone Valley. The land stretched wide and peaceful beneath the morning sun, and the river flowed steadily through the canyon as it always had. Yet the valley would remember what had happened here, because sometimes the strongest bridges between people are not built from words or treaties. Sometimes they begin with something much simpler, a hand offered in the middle of a river, and the quiet courage to take it.